back for Art Matters. And I'm really pleased that I'm able to introduce our next speaker, Julian Brooks. You probably already know because I think he's quite a celebrity, but Julian Brooks is the Getty Museum's department head of drawings, and he was promoted actually just recently upon the retirement of Lee Hendricks. He's one of the most foremost experts of Old Master drawings and a specialist in particular of Italian and British drawings. He's curated many major exhibitions, including one recently on the drawings of Andrea Del Sarto with the dynamic title Del Sarto, the Renaissance Workshop in Action, and that traveled to the Frick. He's also curated or co-curated a large exhibition on Turner at Tate in London and another show of British moderns called London Calling, which I appreciated as a title with the rock reference there. And other major exhibitions that he's curated at the Getty include one on Guercino from 2006 and one on Leonardo in 2010. And he's just about to open a new Michelangelo drawings exhibition, so it's really appropriate then to have him come and speak on this subject. He's really just beginning the installation, I guess, on Monday. So we're very excited to have him here. And I suppose I should mention, too, that the next lecture in this series, which is now once a month, we took a little break for the holidays, the first Thursday of the month, is going to feature our new curator of contemporary art. By coincidence, he just was newly appointed, James Glisson, and so he will be giving the next talk, so I hope you can join us for that one as well. But without further ado, here's Julian, and he, of course, will take questions perhaps at the end, or do you mind if people interrupt?
I think at the end, probably.
Okay, at the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ike, for that that kind introduction, and thank you to you all for such a warm welcome here. And yeah, it's wonderful to be able to talk about Michelangelo, and to actually be having at the Getty, beginning in February 24th, this big exhibition, Michelangelo, Mind of the Master, with some of the very best drawings by him. So very exciting. And I want to talk today with this as a starting point. You know, I mean, it can't get better than this, right? One of the greatest, most famous iconic works in Western art, The Creation, which, as you know, is on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which, if you laid it all out, becomes something like this and flattens it. And it's incredibly complex, incredibly, you know, if you think, you know, Michelangelo painted this in over 4 years, and you know, just look at how complex it is, and think about the amount of planning and to get everything in the right place, all the right scenes, everything looking good, the amount of planning that he must have done. So what I want to talk about today is really the planning process for that, and what we have that remains from it in terms of drawings. Because, of course, all the planning is done on paper. Here, blank sheet of paper. Michelangelo hasn't drawn on this one. But, you know, it reminds one how magical drawing is, you know, that you start with a blank sheet of paper and create onto it. And, you know, that something as iconic as the Sistine ceiling can be planned, projected, every detail sketched on paper. The one downside with paper, and this is something that seems to have been peculiar to Michelangelo, is that he burnt a huge amount of his drawings. And, you know, artists have different relationships to their drawings. Some use them as a studio resource that they're going to come back to again and again. And Michelangelo, his draftsmanship is always incredibly purposeful. So it's towards a specific project. He doesn't then reuse the pose. He doesn't come back to it. So I imagine that, you know, in his head, once he's done with it, he's done with it. And so the result is that we have about 600 drawings by Michelangelo today, which sounds a lot, until you realize that somebody has worked out that if Michelangelo drew just one drawing a day for each day of his working life, there would be 28,000 drawings surviving from him. And we know that he burnt quantities of them through his life. There are lots of letters from different people, including very important patrons, people like Isabella d'Este, writing to him saying, please, Michelangelo, I know you can't do a painting or a sculpture for me, but please can you give me just one of the drawings that you can sign so happily to the flames. And we know that particularly the drawings that relate to the Sistine ceiling, that there were a lot of them lost, particularly in 1518. There's correspondence. Michelangelo had just moved back from Rome to Florence, and he wrote to his faithful retainer in Rome called Celaio. And he wrote to him asking him to basically burn all the drawings that remained in his house in Rome. And there's this very tragic letter from Celaio to Michelangelo in Florence saying, dear master, I have done as you asked, with a very heavy heart, And so, when we look at the Sistine ceiling, I want to just figure out what there is that remains and what hit the flames. Vasari also talks about this habit of Michelangelo's. A little before Michelangelo died, he burned a large number of drawings, sketches, and cartoons, so that no one would see his labor nor the ways of trying his genius, and that he would not appear anything less than perfect. And it gives you a sense of, art historians, at one point they sort of wrote that off a bit as a sort of Vasari gloss, that Vasari, didn't really know Michelangelo's intentions. But we do know that, nowadays people regard that statement by Vasari as being essentially true, that he wanted to sort of only retain the very best, which was the finished works, which is very natural in many ways. And this is a portrait of Michelangelo by Danielle Devoltera, who was a very close friend of his, probably drawn when Michelangelo was about 80 years old, towards the end of his life in Rome. And we know that Michelangelo was very, very secretive in his when he worked on projects. For instance, when he left Florence to go to Rome, he was working on a couple of statues. He had the room walled up so that people couldn't go in and study them. There are endless letters from him to his father in Florence when Michelangelo was in Rome, saying, Father, I told you not to let anyone into my study to look at my drawings, but it seems you have. How could you do this? And he's very, just very particular about keeping everything. And perhaps with good reason, at a certain point, a group of sculptors, including Bartolomeo Ammanati, broke into his house in Florence, stole a bunch of drawings. And Vasari recounts this, and he says, but it was okay because they were returned a bit later. But, you can be sure that in the meantime, they were all copying them like crazy and sketching them and, making records of them. So this is sort of the background. And what I want to do today over the next 45 minutes really is look at it, firstly look at the different types of drawing that Michelangelo made with a view to figuring out, how he goes about projects, what sorts of drawings there are, what sorts of sheets you can expect. Then secondly, to look at the survivors, what still remains from the Sistine ceiling project. And then thirdly, to look at, is there a chance that more Michelangelo sketches for the Sistine ceiling will come to light at some point? I mean, of course, I'm interested in that, right? So let's start with, the types of drawing that Michelangelo made. It's always amazing to think of it, but Michelangelo, like so many other artists in history and artists today, learned by copying other artists, by studying other artists. So this is a drawing by Michelangelo here, where he's studying a figure by Masaccio from this fresco in Santa Maria della Carmine in Florence. And it's difficult to imagine that someone like Michelangelo wasn't just born to draw, but he learned by studying and working hard to gain the craft. He also studied in the studio of Domenico Ghirlandaio in the 1480s. And this is a drawing by Domenico Ghirlandaio. It relates to this fresco here. And you can see, stylistically, you can see how it is. It's made with ink lines, pen and brown ink, and then a lot of hatching and cross-hatching. And this really is Michelangelo's sort of early style, so to speak. He draws a lot with pen and ink, particularly in the early part of his life. And this is a perfect example, made probably around that period, perhaps in the 1490s, a little later, the so-called philosopher. And nobody quite knows who this figure is and what he's meant to be doing or why Michelangelo made this drawing. But you can see stylistically very clearly how the style is taken from his master, Domenico Ghirlandaio. And Michelangelo was very keen to downplay the fact that he ever studied at all. You know, when Vasari published his biography, a few years later, Michelangelo had his friend Ascanio Condivi write a sort of authorized biography in which he sort of rebutted a number of Vasari's claims, and where he also, you know, just glossed over things like his sort of education. You know, it seemed that he wanted his sort of genius to be seen as God-given genius. One of the projects for which we have a number of drawings that gives us an idea of the type of sketches Michelangelo's making was for the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence. And you can see it here in the center of the city, still a prominent building, and where the seat of the council, the Sala del Cinquecento, the room of the 500, the city council, and where they gathered. And the Florentine rulers at the time realized that, you know, when they were decorating this room, that to get the two greatest masters of Renaissance art, Michelangelo and Leonardo, going head to head to decorate parallel walls would be the best thing ever, because they would compete with each other and they would up their game in order to do so. So that was the intention. It never worked out because they were both, they did, you know, part of the project and then lost interest and then went off and did something else. So you have, all that remains now is this is a copy of a cartoon, which is a large drawing made by Michelangelo for the section of his battle scene. It was meant to be a battle scene, which should be horses and fighting, but Michelangelo, because he was so famous for doing depicting the male nude body, chose this moment before the Battle of Cascina, where the troops are bathing, and this allows him to show them strapping on their armor, and to really play to his strength. Leonardo, on the other hand, did complete a little bit of his fresco, but being Leonardo, he was always experimenting with technique, and the technique that he painted it in just sort of started flaking even within years, and there's nothing remains of it today. And this is again an early copy of that scene. So for Michelangelo's section, you know, we have this a copy of the cartoon that he made, but we also have a number of figure drawings that he made like this. Again, you see with the pen and brown ink hatching, but also with white heightening in this case for the highlights, and this for this figure within the composition. And then compositional studies. You know, again, for a project like this, obviously you need to know where things are going and you need to plan. And it's the sort of drawing that just seems to have been easily lost or destroyed, or maybe it's, you know, these all ended up on Michelangelo's bonfires. But this is the only compositional study that remains for the Battle of Cascina. And you can see here, you know, there's this figure is here. You know, there are elements to the composition, but it's this small sheet, just literally a sort of back of the envelope type sort of sketch where he's just figuring out what's going on. But again, a couple of studies. These are in the collection of the Tyler's Museum, and these will be on display in LA in a few weeks' time. And they're large sheets. I mean, every single time I see them, I'm surprised, but they're like this, which for a Renaissance drawing is large. And to dedicate a sheet like that to a life study at the period, to all of us, it's perfectly natural, right? You all see tons of life studies. It's where artists learn. But Michelangelo was the beginning of this, and nobody at that date had made life studies on this scale. And you can see how he's studying every single aspect of the physiognomy here and the musculature of this figure in black chalk. And then he runs out of space on this side of the sheet of paper. And so this arm that's going out, he then draws again on the left up here. And it's sort of charming, I'm sure there are PhD theses to be written on Michelangelo's use of paper, because he does, he has this very charming aspect of sort of running out of space, not quite, and then adding things all around on the sheet. So in this case, you have this figure behind, and he doesn't dedicate much time to the legs because he knows the legs are going to be covered by other figures. So already by now he knows that he has an idea of the composition. And again, you see, he never pays attention to hair, for instance. So you get this little sort of hairnet effect, which just, and then just, this arm, again, he knows will be hidden, so he doesn't really sketch it in. But it's amazing how carefully observed these figures are from the life. And again, with subsidiary sketches of particular aspects. Other drawings, Michelangelo, he was very interested in how the body looked, about musculature, and so it's so natural for him to study anatomy as well. And he was doing that in Florence, particularly in the 1520s. This you'll see a very neat anatomical study. It has all the little letters. And Michelangelo was at one point working on an anatomical treatise that was never published, but he was starting to think about that. But his interest, Leonardo was the greatest anatomical draftsman. And he's interested in the organs, the way the blood pumps, the heart, everything. Michelangelo, it's all about the muscles, the sinews, the bones, the sort of the structure, the way the body is formed, not how the body works. Probably Michelangelo's sort of greatest drawings in many ways are a set of presentation drawings made for people whom he loved very much, for close friends. And these tend to be highly finished, highly worked. This is a so-called ideal head that's in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And a sort of androgynous figure. Nobody, still knows whether it's a man or a woman. But there's an earring here, but refined features, but red chalk used to the nth degree with stumping, with rubbing, creating the dimensionality in the figure here. And, what a wonderful, wonderful gift for somebody. Of course, he's an architect too, and, when Florence is under siege in the late 1520s, he's called upon to design the city defenses, and there are a number of drawings that relate to architectural projects from him, not least the cupola of St. Peter's in Rome. But you have here, an example of an architectural sketch where he's, it's very brief, sketched with pen and ink, but then with, this is in the Casa Buonarroti in Florence, and you see how he fills it in with a brush and a wash as well to give a more complete effect. This sort of drawing is also in the Casa Buonarroti, and it's just stunning for the way, from my point of view, for the way it works up. It's a Madonna and Child, but you see how highly worked up the child is. And this effect, there's a lot of white heightening here. There's red chalk, black chalk. It looks like pen and ink, but it's all chalks. And it reminds us, of course, that Michelangelo was a sculptor. And this sense of having a whole sketch of a whole composition and then just working up a part like this, it's so like his work on, say, the slaves that are in the Louvre. So where he works a bit to a finished, a part of it to a high finish and then leaves other parts and gradually works around the figure. And actually, drawings that relate to sculpture are extremely rare in Michelangelo. Like, the David is one of his most famous sculptures, not a single drawing that relates to it. And this is the figure of Day in the Medici chapel on one of the Medici tombs, and you can see this very prominent knee is the study of a drawing that's now in the Tyler's Museum, that again will be in the LA exhibition. But it's very rare to have a drawing that relates directly to sculpture. And when you do, he often studies them from many angles, as you would expect, because of course, he needs the dimensionality. And you can see how he uses black chalk for these to really recreate the very soft and yet slick surface of marble that he's trying to render. And then there are a few drawings that, like the one of the so-called philosopher, that we just don't know what they relate to. And this is a drawing in the Getty collection that it's the Holy Family resting on the flight into Egypt. There's Christ Child, the young St. John the Baptist, Joseph, inexplicably a couple of angels on the left. And we don't know if this was a design for a painting, if it was just the start of a presentation drawing. But what is fun about this sheet is that actually on the other side, you have the sort of sketches that you just never otherwise find for Michelangelo. Doodles. And he's literally just letting his mind wander on the page. And it's wonderful. You have this little putti here who is sort of playing around. A sort of bird's head with a crazy beak. A little head. A little quote from Petrarch. Tempo verrà ancora, time will come again, written in Michelangelo's handwriting. And these are the sort of drawings that I think must have ended up on the bonfire. That he didn't want to be remembered for this sort of thing. And just very, very few of this type survives at all. And it's also because I think he was such a purposeful draftsman. It's not like he was never recorded as going around with a sketchbook and sketching things. That was Leonardo. Leonardo sketched everything he saw. Michelangelo, it's all back in the studio, basically, focused. And then you have drawings like this. Can anyone guess what this is? When I was working in the Ashmolean many years ago, somebody brought a drawing that looked like this into the print room, and they said, "Oh, what's this?" They said, I've been told it's a drawing of a brick by Michelangelo. And of course, Michelangelo is a sculptor. So when he writes to the quarryman in Carrara asking for bits of marble, why not just sketch it out like this? So that's what this is. It has measurements on it, and he just sketches out the type of block that he wants and the dimensions. And there are actually quite a lot of these drawings around. One came up at auction, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and $75,000. Drawing of a brick by Michelangelo. But what seems to have happened is that all his letters that are kept in the Casa Buonarroti archive in Florence, somebody in like the 17th century, maybe early 18th century, went through it, cut out all of these little sketches, and sold them off. So they do, they appear and they're sort of out there, but very unusual. But then when you see a sketch like this, you realize, of course, what with the dimensions all written in as well, sculptor's drawings. And then finally, at the end of his life, Michelangelo did these wonderful series of drawings of crucifixions that very meditative. He became deeply spiritual at this moment. And they have these incredible figures that, to me, they're sort of caught mid-pose somehow, and they always look like they're walking in molasses or something. They have one foot, they're sort of heavy, solid figures with a very solid center of gravity, often not really interacting. And in this period, he didn't really sculpt or paint for the last 20 years of his life. And what he did was provide drawings like this to some of his friends to make the commissions for him. So, we've had a quick look at some of the types of drawing that he made. And let's now have a look at some of the survivors from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, works that never were burnt. So it's worth remembering that when Michelangelo was commissioned to make the Sistine Chapel ceiling, to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he hadn't never painted a large fresco. He had never painted a fresco. The last time he had worked on a fresco was when he was in Domenico Ghirlandaio's studio. So, what an amazing vote of confidence in the artist that he would deliver on such a project and do it properly. And it's a large scale. I mean, this is a photo of Pope Francis with all the Vatican diplomatic corps. But you get a sense of the scale of the Sistine Chapel. But of course, if you go and see it yourself, you'll probably see something more like this. This sort of melee, right? But when Michelangelo came to it, this was what the ceiling looked like. It was painted in a very traditional Gothic manner. It was blue with little stars painted on it. But in 1506, a big crack had appeared in it. And so Pope Julius II knew that he had to do something to refurbish it, to structurally repair it. And so came up with the idea of this ceiling. And with this ceiling, there's an incredibly complicated whole series, theological design and iconography to the whole ceiling. So all the different episodes from the Old Testament, then figures like Jonah, then the prophets, the Sibyls, the female prophets. And Michelangelo claimed that Pope Julius told him to just go and paint the ceiling and he could do what he wanted, quote. But, that doesn't tally with this. Michelangelo is not that sort of person to come up with this sort of iconography. So art historians have a lot of fun working out who that might have been and trying to figure that out. But one thing that we do know with this fresco is that Michelangelo did it in two parts. The first part between 1508 and 1510, 2 years. And it's the bit furthest away from the altar, which was at this end. And there was a rood screen just here in the middle. And the scaffolding for the first half covered this part. And he could only see the whole ceiling from the ground when the scaffolding came down, obviously. And so what you find is that all the figures, he's here with the flood, tons of tiny figures, even the prophets are smaller. After he takes it down, he realizes that you just can't make out that detail. So he then increases the size of, you see the prophets here, much bigger. And the scenes, such as creation, become much simpler with just huge figures and many fewer figures. So there must have been an element of design to it. I mean, he must have had projects and drawings of the whole ceiling, working things out, working out the iconography. Does any of that survive? Basically, no. I mean, this is one of two drawings that relates to the composition of the Sistine ceiling. And it's, again, a sort of back-of-the-envelope sketch. Even the architecture isn't quite represented quite right. But you can see he started to think about the compartments that will exist on the ceiling. And then for the first half of the ceiling, there are a number of sketches, including these drawings that are in the Ashmolean Museum, which are just unlike any other drawing that we know of by Michelangelo. Like, we've looked at some of the types of drawings he made. But they're so schematic. They're very small. They're about this size. And they're very schematic. Some of them, literally just 6-7 lines. And not really compositional studies. And then occasionally a little sheet with pen sketches. And these, again, are the sort of drawings that I would expect to have been lost, because they don't sort of look like much for drawings as such. And they're not, not impressive large sheets. And yet you can see clearly, how he's studying specific components of the ceiling in them, even with just a few lines. And some of the other early one of the very few early drawings that we have for one of the Sibyls is this sketch of the drapery here. And you can see it's not, when he gets to doing the painting, it's not exactly the same, but it's the sort of drawing that was a hangover from the Ghirlandaio studio, where they would take cloth, dip it in plaster, then arrange it over a lay figure, like a wooden figure, and let it dry, and then just sketch it and sketch it and sketch it. Much easier than having a model sitting there. And so, and I think it's just the most incredibly beautiful drawing. And if you can see here this detail, the hatching, the sense, the weight of line. And, don't forget that he's not using, when we say pen and brown ink, which this is, he's not pulling a pen out of his pocket. He's using a feather quill, sharpened, dipped in ink, judging exactly how much ink is on the quill at each line, getting all the weight of ink that he needs, the cross-hatching to create these very elegant folds. And we know that the second half of the ceiling was painted much more quickly and in a ferocious hurry. And I think drawings like this just went by the board at that point. Like, a few survived for that first part, but for the second part, really nothing. And then head studies. Again, in this period, for some reason, he's working in black chalk much more than in red chalk. And we don't quite know why. That's what survives anyway, the few that survive. But you can see how, drawing from life and studying, here a sort of older face to be made into the fresco with unfortunate cracking here, makes it look very old, but really, expressive and then transferred into the fresco. And again, black chalk studies for the ignudi, and these were nude male figures that, again, when he started the ceiling, they were very relatively sort of tame, sort of seated here, and yet by the end of the ceiling, they become more and more dynamic, and they were something that was praised increasingly by his contemporaries. So in terms of compositional studies, we saw for the whole ceiling, there's basically nothing. In terms of the individual scenes, again, practically nothing. One of the very few scenes for which there's a compositional sketch is this one of Judith and Holofernes. And this is the sketch. So you see, in this sketch, which must have been made very early on, he hasn't even accounted for the shape, the spandrel shape. It's just literally rectangular. He plays with the two figures, lifting the head here, very similar, and little, almost stick figures as well. And then the figure of Holofernes, which in the drawing you can't really see, but it's rather gory. His head that's been decapitated, he is sort of leaning out sort of over into the fresco, and in the actual fresco he makes him sort of leaning back, so more sort of appropriate for a church space. But this drawing is on the back of this sheet. And the weird thing about that is that this drawing is made about 1504 when he's in Florence working on the Battle of Cascina. This is made about 1508 in Rome. So, he obviously took bundles of drawings with him from Florence to Rome. He kept them, which is very unlike what we know of him. Maybe he didn't want other people to see them, so he just keep them safe. But then why sort of sketch on the other side like this in such a loose way at such a distance of time? And it's the sort of question we'll never really know. So when he's working on the ceiling, as I say, it was the first big fresco project he did after working with Ghirlandaio. So he needs some expert help. He actually he hires no fewer than 5 of his contemporaries from the Ghirlandaio studio to help him work on this. And he gets up to about here, and then Vasari, who is sort of Michelangelo's friend and tends to write things on his behalf, said, Michelangelo got tired of working with them and felt their work wasn't up to quality, so he fired them all, locked them out of the chapel. And we don't think that really happened. We know that he had advice from at least one of them, Jacopo Sansovino, for the whole project. But after this point, he does essentially paint the whole thing himself. So there are a couple of little sketches. There's this one sketch here where he shows the sort of scaffolding that he would have been on, this curved scaffolding with steps, where he's painting the vaulted ceiling. And then there's this very famous sonnet that he wrote with a little sketch here of him painting the ceiling. You see here, arm raised above his head. And, it's difficult to imagine, but, when he's doing this, the scaffolding blocks out all the light. Everything, he's painting by lamplight. So the soot, the smoke, he can't stand back, he can't see, it's sort of hell. And so in his sonnet, he writes to Giovanni da Pistoia, he writes, I've already grown a goiter at this drudgery, as the water gives the peasants in Lombardy, or else it may be in some other country, which sticks my stomach by force beneath my chin. With my beard toward heaven, I feel my memory box, the back of my head, atop my bump. I'm getting a harpy's breast. And the brush that is always above my face, by dribbling down, makes it an ornate pavement. My loins have entered my belly, and I make my ass into a crupper as counterweight. Without my eyes, my feet move aimlessly. In front of me, my hide is stretching out, and to wrinkle up behind, it forms a knot, and I'm bent like a Syrian bow. And he writes at several points at this stage, I'm not a painter. I shouldn't be doing this. I'm a sculptor. I should be working on the tomb that Julius had me do. What am I doing here? But he does it. And, drawing is a part of it. And he really seems to be working in a frenzy at this point. He's sketching, and we'll have a look at some of the sketches that relate to some of the figures in the second half of the ceiling. So one of them, and I think this is probably, for my money, the most beautiful drawing that relates to the Sistine ceiling. Again, this will be in the show in LA, and it's on all our. You'll see it on banners across Los Angeles if you go down there. And the city of LA is very, very. I learned is very. What's the word? Careful about butts, and so the banner has to be in two parts, with this bit carefully excised. The things you learn as an art historian, it's amazing, isn't it? But anyway, I think one of the most gorgeous drawings in red chalk. What I love is the way that he works up some bits very highly finished with hatching, cross-hatching, stumping, rubbing of the chalk. And then the face, just this parallel lines that just give you enough information. And again, this panoply of other bits drawn around. So again, he runs out of room on this side of the paper for this arm. So he draws it here with the bent arm and the finger. And clearly drawn from life, sitting on you see a covered bench or something here with drapery. And I love the toes that are sort of pentimenti, these small changes in the toes as he figures out the pressure there. But it's amazing to me that he's working in a frenzy on the ceiling. Admittedly, this is one of the larger figures, a big Ignudo figure. And you see how much more dramatic it is than the early Ignudi figures. But that he still dedicates such time to a sketch like this. And you can see here, another aspect is that he develops this shorthand for himself, this little mark here, which nobody quite knows what it means, but it's a little note to himself. And I think it's to do with this sort of drapery in the background, that he's saying to himself, this is sort of where that's going to go, so this is a silhouette, I think. But nobody knows. But he also does a lot of white heightening on this sheet. So you can see here in this view taken from an oblique angle, you see all the white heightening here for all the highlights. So it's made like a finished drawing, but it's covered in all these sketches. It's just for himself. It's not. It's made like one of his ideal drawings as a present for somebody, and yet it obviously gives him what he needs to make the fresco. And if you turn the sheet over, you find this, just tons and tons of sketches. And I'll just go through this sheet because it's amazing to sort of take them apart and see what all these sketches relate to. And the answer is they relate to the group around God. So what I'll do is I'll put the drawing down here and then take out the little bit of it that relates. So here you see this bit relates to this angel that's sort of flying above God. This one here is this figure of Eve beneath God's arm. And you can see how he knows that God's arm is going to go there. So, but that's not the interest in this sketch. It's all about the hands, the muscles, the figure. He knows that all of this is going to be covered by God, so he doesn't bother sketching that. And then the shoulder, he realizes from this sketch it's going to be much more prominent, so he does another sketch on the sheet there of the shoulder, just showing the arm, the muscles around the shoulder. Then, of course, for the arm, this famous arm of God, he does another sketch here, again concentrating on the shoulder, which he will then clothe. Then at the top of the sheet, he turns the sheet 180 degrees, and you get a pretty famous arm. So that's, when we looked at this sheet, we saw that he didn't really deal with the face. And the face is sketched on another sheet. And you see here the face of the Signudo. And you see here how when you look at it closely, it was done so much from life. The teeth, the wrinkles in the neck, everything is absolutely studied from life and lifelike. And then it's sort of made a little more generic in the fresco, which of course is going to be so much bigger than the drawing. We're going to reproduce a part of the Sistine ceiling on the wall at the Getty in life size. And it's pretty amazing, just the scale that you have to work up to here. But of course, on this sketch with the head, there are a bunch of other sketches too. So let's just look at what they relate to. And again, the same group. So you have, again, I'm going to put the drawing up here, top right. And then you have, again, some legs, the legs of God. And he knows, again, this one, they're folded, just sketched with a couple of lines. And then the toes. Again, just working out the shadows, working out the anatomy, exactly where the bones, where the muscles are. He's already planned roughly the lighting for this. And so he knows where the direction of the light will come from. This leg, he thinks at that point is going to be lit on this angle, but then in the end he paints it all in shade. But you can see the amount of studies that he's going through just for this group. And if you turn this sheet over, you get another sheet of studies. And again, just to quickly sort of dissect them all and see what they relate to. So of course, the famous hand of God, which is amazing to think that the genesis of something like this is just this very casual sketch on this crazy sort of sheet of studies. Then this figure, an angel flying underneath God, sort of supporting him, is the subject of this study, again with the paper turned. And you can see how, he doesn't care about the head, the hair, anything. It's all about the shoulders, about the muscles and the back. He knows that he's going to have this bit of drapery here that's already in the drawing. He knows this leg is not is going to be covered. This one, again, isn't of concern right here. It's very purposeful. Again, here you have this Putto, this genius to the left of God, quickly sketched. And then the knee, he realizes that the knee here isn't quite right for this sort of pudgy thigh. So he then does another study on the same sheet, but with it turned, of the knee here. And then finally this sketch that relates to this figure. It's sort of in shadow, but looking rather precarious there, hanging on, and but with these crossed leg and the arm coming across his body. So, we've seen 2 sheets of studies on which he sketches lots of parts of this, but obviously not, the head of God, not God. There are lots of other different bits that haven't been covered in that. And the figure of Adam, there's only one drawing that relates to it. And it's a pretty amazing drawing. It's in the British Museum. And again, he's not thinking of the hand here. He's literally just thinking of the torso, and sketched with immense detail. And I love these searching lines that you find on the thigh as he just figures out the exact angle that he wants. And you can imagine him drawing such a sheet, even though it's detailed. It's drawn so quickly and really drawn in a frenzy. And then the hand here, he doesn't bother with the arm behind, but the hand sketched carefully there too. And you can see here very well these lines. And then again with Michelangelo, as always, these little subsidiary studies arranged around it. So we've seen here, a number of drawings that relate to particularly the scene of the creation. The other drawings that survive for the second half are basically for the most important figures, the Sibyls and the Ignudi. So we have in particular the Libyan Sibyl here, studied in this amazing drawing at the Met, which again, I love the fact that, there she is, and there she is. But the toes, these sort of tiny little sketches of toes that really, bring it to life. And the figure again, he has, even though he's painting most of the ceiling himself, he has workers who prepare the plaster, who mix the paints. And so he has male models around. And so, of course, the Libyan Sibyl, even though it's a woman, it's studied from a male model. And he then clothes it and appropriately. And you have sketches of particular aspects like the hand. Again, he knows the composition. He knows what pose she's going to be in. But he's studying the details. If you turn that sheet over, you get the figure in a very quick black chalk sketch without all the drapery. And what I wonder is, we saw that very beautiful pen and ink hatch drawing of drapery from the first half of the ceiling. But here, did he do such a drawing for the drapery? I mean, there's nothing exists. Or is he by now just working in red chalk, working much more quickly and effectively? There's also this drawing that's in the Ashmolean, red chalk sketches, and then sketches for the slaves that were for the tomb of Pope Julius, which he really would rather have been working on, sculpture. But this beautiful study from a model that you assume must be for an ignudo or some quite important part of the ceiling. It's actually for like a background figure for the Libyan Sibyl. And it's a young Puto, but he studies to get it absolutely right. He studies every aspect of the muscles and the outline to get even such a relatively minor figure precisely right. And again, hands sketched in detail. And then there are a couple of studies as well for ignudi, for these large, the male nude figures. This one in Cleveland. And then this one in the Albertina for this ignudo as well. Again, much more highly finished with white heightening as well. And then a curious drawing for this figure of Haman in this corner. Again, probably the last drawings he's making right towards the end of the project. The figure of Haman, you see here, who's crucified. And you see a study, we have a study here, which is, again, it'll be in the exhibition in LA, it's in the Tyler's Museum. And you see the arm coming across the face, and a study for the hand, the arm behind. And then in the British Museum, there's a study for the whole figure there as well. and for the knee, etc. If you turn over this sheet, you get this, which there's this whole series of black chalk lines. And in 1995, Carmen Bambach, who is one of the great scholars of Michelangelo, was studying this sheet. And one of the great mysteries with Michelangelo is what happened to all the cartoons that he used for making the ceiling. You know, and when I say cartoon, you're probably thinking like Disney, Mickey Mouse. But cartoon, you know, is a large sheet of paper. In Italian, everything large is one, so a large umbrella is an ombrellone. So a large sheet of paper is a cartone, a large, made from lots of small sheets glued together. And it enabled Michelangelo to, he could sketch things in full scale. And presumably would help because he could do it on ground level and then figure out the proportions. Then when he gets to the ceiling, they were nailed into the plaster, the wet plaster. And some of the nails still survive in the ceiling, even if the cartoons don't. And they could then be transferred. And he used two methods of doing that. One is very painstaking pricking with a pin and then dusting chalk dust through. And he did that for more or less the first half. And then the second half, he uses the other technique much quicker, where you take a sharp point and you just incise the cartoon. And it then leaves the incision mark in the plaster for making the fresco. But the trouble is it also basically disfigures the cartoon because you score it. But no cartoons remain. And we think that basically they were all destroyed in that fire in 1518 when his retainer Celaio burned the drawings in his house, including the cartoons. But this is actually the only remaining cartoon relating to the Sistine ceiling. And it's a cartoon fragment. And I know that you can't make it out. And when you look at it here, it suddenly becomes clear. What seems to have happened is he was originally going to show the whole of Haman's face. And then he cut away a bit of the cartoon that he wasn't, that he decided then to cover it with his arm there, move the arm in. So he didn't need this bit of cartoon for the face. But if you look, what I've done is put this up against there. You see how it's the contour of his cheek, the lip, the nose, the nostril there of Haman. And so it's basically a cartoon. It's where he's cut it away because he didn't need to use it. And then he used it for the figure of the head study and everything else. And that's the only bit of cartoon that remains for the whole ceiling. But it shows you what these cartoons would have looked like. Very simple black chalk lines that were just to set out the design. So the last question, just briefly, are there, can we expect to come across some that we know he burned lots of them, but obviously some of them survived. The ones in the Tyler's Museum that I've just shown you, we don't know quite how or why, but they clearly survived as a group. We think maybe Danielle Devoltera, his friend at the end of his life, perhaps he gave them to him. Danielle had a couple of pupils who also were friends of Michelangelo, and perhaps Michelangelo gave them to them. But it was very unlike Michelangelo to give drawings out then. But, in terms of what there might be, we've seen, these are more or less the bits that have drawings relating to them. You can see the bits that didn't. So lots of drawings potentially that did exist that don't exist now. But Vasari gives us a couple of clues. He says that the heirs of Girolamo degli Albizzi in Florence owned 4 cartoons from the Sistine vault with figures of Ignudian prophets. And that Michelangelo presented the Florentine banker Bindo Altoviti with a cartoon of the drunkenness of Noah. So, these little clues. And I sort of dream that at some point somebody like Larry or somebody will be going around a house in Florence and, they'll have a rolled up bit of paper that they say, oh, this is an old bit of paper. Look, maybe it's a map. It's got all these black lines on it. Doesn't make any sense. And that will be one of these cartoons, perhaps, But drawings by Michelangelo do come to light. And just finally, to illustrate that, I'll show this drawing, which the Getty acquired a couple of years ago, and which came to light well, it's the most extraordinary drawing. I mean, it has all this early hatching that he does, with the crisscross hatching of pen and ink, and then white heightening on the sleeve here. And the penwork goes underneath and on top of the white heightening. It's a mourning figure. We don't actually know what it relates to. But this sheet came to light in 1995 in Castle Howard, which, if it seems familiar, it's probably because you've been watching Brideshead Revisited, or you did. That's where that was shot many years ago. But it was found there by Julian Stock, who's a specialist at Sotheby's. And he was doing a routine appraisal up there in Castle Howard. And in the library, in one of these bookcases, he found this 19th century volume of random sort of family sketches, old watercolors, bits and bobs that were stuck into it. And he turned the page, and there was this drawing. And he said it was, well, he said just one word beginning with F, an expletive, apparently. And but he said it was like recognizing his mother's handwriting on an envelope, that it was absolutely clear to him, Michelangelo, this is Michelangelo. And he was absolutely right, and subsequent studies have proved that. But it's extraordinary that something like this should turn up in that way. So I leave you with three thoughts today. One, if you think of Michelangelo's long life, he died just short of his 89th birthday. All the projects he did, how very few relatively drawings that relate to these projects exist, and how much of that process that we've lost to the flames. And secondly, if you see a book like this somewhere, it's worth a look, right? And then thirdly, I think, for me, looking at the process of how Michelangelo made the Sistine ceiling, this iconic, one of the most iconic works of Western art, and the drawings involved, you've seen all the different stages he went through. It always brings home to me the sort of magic of drawing and of working on paper, and yet of how fragile that paper is. So this is a little cartoon. I love these two little cartoon figures. One says to the other, "Someone told me we're just marks on a piece of paper." And that's it, right? It's so magic, and it's amazing. So thank you so much for your attention this afternoon. Thank you. As Ike says, I'm very happy to take any questions if you have them for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, feel free to chat afterwards. Yeah.
Two things.
Yeah.
There was no large fresco before the Sistine of anything even like that, right? That big? I don't think, not that I can.
Well, not on that scale, for sure. Absolutely. But of course, there are in Florence. There are lots of ceiling. There are lots of,
Yeah, there were a lot of things like that.
Yeah,
and
but
Vasari says that when he shut down after the first half, Bramante took Raphael in there.
Yeah.
Raphael changed his style.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, he was, Raphael was Michelangelo's great rival, and everyone was desperate to see it. But
it influenced for 100 years. Right?
Well, Michelangelo went to Bologna to see the Pope begging for money to be paid, like for the work he's done. And in the meantime, Raphael's sneaking in, looking at, But it did. Raphael's style becomes.
He really loved that because that was his rival.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. Back.
Could you give us a sense of how long it took to do some of these drawings?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know, but some of them, certainly the little pen sketches are super brief, like a couple of minutes. But even the longer, like the one found in Castle Howard, which with all the hatching and everything, Michelangelo, when you look at them, the lines, even though there are lots of lines, they're drawn quickly. So, I imagine that something like that wouldn't take him more than a few hours. I mean, he's literally, he's there, it comes together. And at that stage, he's so fluent in draftsmanship. But it's something we don't know. But he's recorded even in old age as like sitting in his study, drawing for hours and hours a day. And this is why, you know, when the estimate of that he's did, you know, that if he did one drawing a day, every day of his working life, and there would then be 28,000 drawings, you know, you must be thinking of a figure like that, because he didn't just do one drawing a day, I'm sure. You know, particularly the Sistine project, he's working in a frenzy. He's really throwing them out there. But yeah, it's always a cause of amazement to me how quickly some of them could have been done. Yeah.
During the Renaissance period, as it relates to sketching, was there a benefit for using red chalk versus black chalk?
Well, it's curious, and it seems to be such a personal choice. I mean, benefits of black chalk and red chalk, and we don't really know why. But you know, Michelangelo seems to go broadly from you know, pen and ink in the beginning. Then he used a lot of red chalk around the Sistine ceiling period. Then he starts using much more black chalk, and the drawings that remain for the Last Judgment in like the 1530s are black chalk, and the drawings, the Crucifixion, the end of his life, all black chalk. So he goes off red chalk. We don't know why, if he just gets sort of used to working in it, if, yeah, I mean, the difference, obviously, the tone, red chalk's very, very fluent for representing the human figure, but so is black chalk. They're both easily available, basically. We don't know. It comes into a personal preference, I'm afraid. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you in the back, yeah.
I was curious about the materials. Have you noticed anything interesting about the paper of the drawings and how the paper was made, or how the ink differs from drawing to drawing?
Yeah. I mean, about the paper and the ink and the materials that he uses. It's funny, and I mean, he does seem to use basically pretty good quality paper all the time, like proper letter writing paper. And he's writing letters all the time too, so he has that around. I mean, some artists, like I worked on Guercino, and he used a lot of really low-grade paper, which the sort of paper that if you go to Italy, you buy a bit of cheese, sometimes they'll wrap it in paper. They'll use that sort of rough paper. But Michelangelo, there's like a few drawings I know of in this much rougher paper, but generally quite good quality paper. He uses them, you know, he uses a lot of the sheet like we saw with all the sketches around. He uses the versos. He has this really ambivalent relationship to them, because he'll keep them, as we've seen, but then sometimes he then just uses them like years later for a shopping list. And so, you know, is it just he runs out of paper in the house? Like, what is it? Like, you know, and he's obviously keeping accounts and everything too. But there's nothing particular about his paper or particular type as such. And he doesn't use blue paper ever, which is interesting because you do have blue paper in the Renaissance. He doesn't tend to use color in the drawings that survive. Like, he doesn't mix the chalks, which other people, Andrea del Sarto, for instance, were doing. No, it's interesting. I mean, it's one always, with a set of drawings, you get an interest, you get an insight into the mind of an artist, but you also wonder what you've lost and maybe there are tons of watercolors by Michelangelo that he just burned, but I don't think so. But anyway, yeah. But again, thank you so much. If you have further questions, do come and ask me. Yep, thank you.